Just over 120 years ago, in October 1891, the Cairns Post published the poem Missions to Blacks, which in part reads, "He asked for bread and not for stones, some corner where to lay his bones. We hunt him from the land instead, and stones we give in place of bread. And the fair land of Queensland free shall teach the blacks the litany. Where now his happy hunting ground, those marked with murderous-looking mounds, and what, pray, are the dark contents of those sad lonely monuments? Revenge and murder come accursed, troopers report, the blacks dispersed, and the fair land of troopers free have taught the blacks their litany." The Queensland frontier had been expanding for 50 violent years when the journalist GTB wrote this about the treatment of Aboriginal people, and the killing was to last another 20-odd years. Despite his poetic acknowledgements, GTB also ran a caustic attack on J.B. Gribble's attempts to establish a mission as tying up land which could be used by white settlers. Associated with this was the subsequent publicity given to public secrets in Cairns, that is, massacres, which may well have been the factor that influenced the negative view of the missionary by bringing the district into disrepute within the colony. Many others who protested had in fact been involved in frontier violence. This apparent contradiction suggests that initially certain frontiersmen, but not all, adopted this violent response. But then the continuing nature of this brutality infringed upon their conscience and caused them to acknowledge the events and decry them. It appears that there are two distinct patterns of censorship and disclosure throughout the frontier period. Initially, while the killing was proceeding, perpetrators were trying to shut down the debate and conceal evidence, and whistleblowers, who are far fewer on the ground, but often quite determined, despite community censure, were continually trying to open it up. A seesaw interpretive struggle was going on, with the state very determinedly on the side of suppression. In fact, members of the executive and wealthy landowners are largely orchestrating it, while elements of the liberal press are trying to get at the truth. Later, with the frontier winding down and closing around the 1890s to federation, however, the denialism becomes far more hegemonic, pervading education, literature, media, religion and politics. In short, a new total paradigm of good and peaceful Australia is being rapidly forged to shore up a new nationalism. The opposition to this paradigm becomes extremely muted and marginalised. The original smaller conspiracy, in effect, keeps getting bigger and bigger. Up to the 1970s, a big silence regarding the convict era and Aborigines pervaded Australia's understanding of its past. It was only with the lead-up to the 1988 bicentenary that a popular change in attitude began. What had, for over 150 years, been hidden, swept under the carpet, was starting to be claimed by convict descendants. Australians began to not only acknowledge a convict ancestor, but also to be proud of it. Nevertheless, just as previous generations had selective amnesia in relation to the convict era, so too has this approach been applied to the violence on the frontier and the treatment of Aboriginal Australians. The advent of the Mile Creek Massacre in what is now northern New South Wales and the subsequent hanging of 7 white perpetrators set in motion the squatters' approach to violence on the frontier. They kept quiet about it. It is this aspect that has become white Australia's conspiracy of silence. It is possible to see that what was espoused officially had little to do with what was actually going on. Certainly the massacre of 11 whites at Hornet Bank in 1857 led to horrendous retaliation, as also did the massacre of 19 whites at Kulin-Laringo, 300 kilometres to the northwest, 4 years later in 1861. There were reasons for these attacks by the local Indigenes. Hornet Bank was the result of the settlers' oldest sons having sexual relations with local women, for which their mother warned them not to participate. The Kulin-Laringo or Wills massacre occurred because a nearby station owner had killed members of the local tribe, and this was a retaliatory response which was readily acknowledged at the time. However, the squatters' response was totally out of all proportions, with some 400 Aborigines killed in relation to Hornet Bank and some 370 in response to Kulin-Laringo. In regard to mapping these massacres, it is extremely difficult to identify numbers killed, particularly in the area of central Queensland, where only archaeological evidence today hints at the numbers of people who lived in the region and where none or very few live today. I have mapped those clashes that rated 5 and more Aboriginal deaths, and for which there is corroborative evidence. This is not to trivialise the tragic sporadic killings of individuals and small groups, but to give an indication to the veracity of what was at the time referred to as the Black Wars of Queensland. Inland, across to the Northern Territory border, there seems to be a reduction until the western side of the Gulf, where the killing times return with a vengeance. Tony Roberts' research has identified that many of the squatters came from the central Queensland area, where they appeared to have learnt their aggressive approach to establishing their runs. So the gaps in central Queensland are not representative of what occurred. Queensland came into existence on the 10th of December 1859, and the colony, which had begun with 7.5 in its treasury, desperately needed more revenue from renting out land to squatters. Gold rushes, first at Canoona, Gympie, and then the Palmer River Gold Rush, followed by the Hodgkinson, all boosted population and revenues for the colony. The impoverished nature of Queensland's finances partially explains the official attitude towards tolerating or ignoring frontier violence. The establishment of the New South Wales Native Police in 1848 and their operations on the Darling Downs were to lead to an escalation in the numbers of Aborigines killed on the northern frontier. In the 12 months to August 1849, Aboriginal resistance was estimated to have cost the Darling Downs, Moreton Bay and Wide Bay districts £10,000 and made labour scarce and dear. This acute labour shortage was also affected by the abolition of transportation of convicts to New South Wales in 1840 and by rushes to the Californian, Victorian and New South Wales goldfields. A war of resistance by Aborigines of the Moonee, McIntyre and Barwon rivers in the area now bounded by St George, Gundawindi and Moree led to 17 stations on the McIntyre being abandoned in 1843. And only 13 had been re-established after 1846. The Indigenous campaign to rid the district of white settlers led to their targeting settlers' horses and cattle and seriously endangering the newcomers' economic viability. The leaseholder of Carbucky Station, D. Lanark, had within a year lost over half of the 1,600 head of cattle that he brought to his run in 1847. Matters were not helped by the violent vigilante actions by some of the settlers, such as James Marks at Goodar, who in September 1847 shot a native boy sent by the neighbouring Callandoon station to share meat from a recently killed beast. This outraged the Bagambul, one of whom, in retaliation, killed Marks's son and dismembered his body. A year-long reign of terror on the local Indigenous people by Marks and his fellow landowners and stockmen resulted. At least 47 Aboriginal people died in a series of attacks that followed. Within a year, attacks had been made on Indigenous people camped on Carbucky, Broomfield, Callandoon and Umbercolly stations, surrounding the future Gundawindi. In the 1840s, Queensland was being explored and the foundations for separation from New South Wales were being laid. A newspaper correspondent, Frederick Sinnott, commented on frontier race relations at the new gold rush settlement of Canoona on the traditional lands of the Darrumbal near Rockhampton. It is
that of war to the knife. The atrocities on both sides are perfectly horrible. And I do not believe the government makes any effort to stop the slaughter of the Aborigines. A native police force is indeed actively engaged, but exclusively against the blacks who are shot.
The British colony of Queensland came into being with a white population of 28,000 and a conservatively estimated Indigenous population of 250,000. A year and a half later, the Queensland report of the Select Committee on the Native Police had considered one witness who estimated that 250 white people had been killed over the 19-year period 1842 to 61. The role of poisoning and the desperate behaviour of whites was openly acknowledged in the Queensland Daily News and Mail in mid-1933, when there were still men living who had participated in the violence on the frontier. In January 1842, the frightened shepherds of Kilcoy Creek, some 100 kilometres to the northwest of Brisbane town, were of this order, when they fled their outstation and left poisoned flour behind, which caused some 60 agonising Aboriginal deaths. A descendant of the owner of the run, John Mackenzie Smith, suggests that it was most likely Sir Evan Mackenzie's brother, Colin John, who gave the authority for instigating this ruthless form of dispersal. 40 years later, William Coote assessed the validity of the Kilcoy poisoning and noted,
"The inquiry of the overseer pointed not to an experiment, but a method, something already tried and found sufficient for the purpose, and intended to be repeated as occasion might seem to require."
One can glean an indication of frontier violence on the inner Darling Downs from the reminiscences of a swashbuckling English adventurer, William Stamer, who went there during the late 1850s. He observed,
"It was enough to make one's blood run cold to listen to the stories we were told of the diabolical manner in which whole tribes had been rubbed out by unscrupulous squatters. No device by which the race could be exterminated had been left untried. One lady on the upper Condamine River had particularly distinguished herself in the poisoning line, having disposed of more natives than any other squatter by means of arsenic alone."
Some 25 years later and further up the coast, Harold Finch Hatton, in his 1886 recollections of his 8 years on the Queensland frontier, tells of a gentleman from Long Lagoon who is still famous for the tremendous haul of blacks which he made in one day. He pretended to take a loaded wagon of stores to his outstation and orchestrated a wheel coming off and abandoning the vehicle, knowing that the local Aborigines would ransack the provisions. The rations contained about as much strychnine as anything else, and not one of the mob escaped. More than 100 blacks were stretched out by this ruse of the owner of the Long Lagoon. This was a part of Mount Spencer Station, some 50 kilometres inland from Mackay, and was owned by the Finch Hatton brothers. These were members of the English aristocracy. Pastoralists from the older colonies of New South Wales and Victoria were trying their luck with their attempts to carve out new territory, and then hopefully selling it for a profit and reinvesting in more land further out. In early 1879, Sub-Inspectors Kay and Goff and their troopers made their 3 patrols out of Bluff Station. On the 3rd patrol, just before Annandale Station, they found a large camp and dispersed them. William Paul, writing to the police commissioner in Adelaide from his station at Kawarri on Warburton Creek, noted the response to the killing of a stockman working for Urquhart and Fraser at Kalidjawari Station.
A party from different stations made a raid on the blacks, killing 27 of them. Shortly afterwards, the native police made a second raid, killing 29 more. This so frightened those remaining in that locality that they came down the creek into South Australia.
Paul later mentions the response to the killing of a white man on Campbell's Glengyle Station, where the whites again combined and killed 11 blacks. Within a decade of John Costello and Patrick Durack invading the region in the late 1860s, granddaughter Mary Durack identified,
"Many settlers now openly declared that Western Queensland could only be habitable for whites when the last of the blacks had been killed out, by bullet or by bait.
During the 1880s, there were 3 major massacres in the vicinity of the white settlement of Birdsville. All 3 occurred while Aboriginal inhabitants were participating in great ceremonial gatherings. Mick McLean Irrangilly, the last man to be brought up in the Simpson Desert before white contact,
knew about the massacre of the Wardamba people near Popple's Corner. The Wardamba ceremony was in full swing when many people from 5 tribes were shot down by police in retribution for the murder of a white man. The worst massacre was probably the one at Wirrabee near Clifton Hills. Nobody escaped.
Irrangilly also told of the end of the Mindiri people at Kunchira waterhole in northeastern South Australia. Today, where there was once a thriving population of indigenous clan groups, there are but a remnant of Aboriginal descendants and a very small number of whites. Such is the legacy of the white pastoral invasion. In the far north from Rockhampton in May 1864, the Jardine brothers drove 250 head of cattle on the first attempt to take livestock up the west coast of Cape York Peninsula. Frank and Alex Jardine managed to kill over 31 Indigenous people when they came across a gathering of some 80 men on the Alice River participating in ceremony. The party shot perhaps as many as 72 Aborigines in 11 separate incidents without incurring a single casualty themselves. Today there are big gaps in the genealogies of the clans of the top-end groups on the Alice, Okunjan, Okungan and Olkal, as well as visiting neighbouring clans whose territory it was that the Jardines trespassed upon. The late Cockabaron elder, Kenny Jimmy, recalled another event that occurred later between the Staten and Nassau rivers on Cattle Creek.
From Croydon to Normanton, come along the coast area far to Cattle Creek, and that's where the Aboriginal people area was there. They was camping out to happen, and they come along and shot them old people in the water there. While they was hunting in the water, swimming, hunting for fish, cattle. All my Aboriginal people was got shot there at Cattle Creek. The river was all bloodshed, and they picked them bodies up and just stacked them up in the sand ridge. Till today you can still see the bone.
In 1865, Sub-Inspector Passion reported 4 major dispersals of blacks between the 4th and the 10th of June near the Expedition Range and Comet River. The numbers were never divulged. During the 1860s, white settlers, banking on making their fortune, continued to move into central Queensland. Cora Halcombe Wills was one of them. Wills wrote in his diary,
"There is very little of the dispersing going on now in the colonies. What there is must be done very much on the quiet. But in my time they were dispersed by hundreds, if not thousands. On one of my dispersing expeditions, they had no idea that we could reach them to a dead certainty of a mile by our little patent breech-loading terriers."
Wills then tells us that he kidnapped a little girl who rode on the front of the saddle the 80 miles to Bowen with her crying nearly all the way. If all this was not enough, he then incredibly tells us,
"I took it into my head to get a few specimens of certain limbs and head of a blackfellow. When my friends were looking on, I went to work businesslike to take off the head first, and then the arms, and then the legs, and gather them together and put them into my pack saddle."
Cora Wills became the Mayor of Bowen in 1867 and later Mayor of Mackay from 1876 to 77. In 1866, 2 years after George Ilfeston Dalrymple had arrogantly informed the Wagome in the Cardwell district opposite Hinchinbrook Island that he'd come to take the land and that they must not interfere, John Ewan Davidson recorded that the blacks were
pursued and shot down. It was a strange and painful sight to see a human being running for his life and see the black police galloping after him and hear the crack of carbines.
The Djurubal and Girame were to experience many more violent encounters, particularly after the wreck of the Maria on the Barrier Reef in 1872. Some survivors were killed by local Aborigines, and others were looked after. From Cardwell came a retribution party with Sub-Inspector Robert Arthur Johnston and his troopers, and a posse of local settlers who annihilated the Djuru opposite Dunk Island. In the rainforests inland from Cardwell, the late Girame elder, Jack Morita.
One day my uncle come over from Kennedy Valley to visit the people here, and he had some relatives here. And as he come, and there was silence. It sounds like nobody was around. And he come a bit closer, and he looked. It's not a sign of anyone movement of anybody. So he come a bit closer, and he can smell that big stink. Smell very strong. So he walked right up to the camp, and he seen it, the dead bodies are laying everywhere. And he believed that they was all been poisoned with the strychnine.
It was gold that brought Europeans to far north Queensland in October 1873 to the Palmer River goldfield. Over 90 miners and government officials landed as the precursor to thousands of new arrivals. Some 110 individuals made up this first party, which was then involved in 3 collisions. Nearly 50 years later, William J. Webb recalled,
"The stars were still shining. A crowd of natives came up yelling out a terrible war cry, about 70 yards from where we lay, just as dawn was breaking. We fired over their heads, but some of the men fired straight back at the blacks, some of whom fell. Thereupon the blacks ran away and were pursued as far as a large lagoon, and all that went there stayed there."
This became known as Battle Camp, where between 80 and 150 Gugawara were killed, which was later compounded by the poisoning of waterholes. A myriad of other lesser-known conflicts and killings continued as miners and pastoralists moved across Cape York. In 1876, 150 kilometres to the south, the Hodgkinson goldfield was established and the port of Cairns founded in October to service the new field. Within 8 years occurred one of Cairns' best-kept secrets. At a site not far north of Yungaburra, Jack Kane, as an 18-year-old in 1884, told,
"He took part in a police raid which lasted a week, culminating in a roundup at Skull Pocket and others following at Mulgrave River and near the 4 Mile. At Skull Pocket, police officers and native trackers surrounded a camp of Idingi blacks before dawn, each man armed with a rifle and revolver. At dawn, one man fired into their camp and the natives rushed away in 3 other directions. There were easy running shots close up. The native police rushed in with their scrub knives and killed off the children. A few years later, a man loaded up a whole case of skulls and took them away as specimens. Old Jack stated, 'I didn't mind killing off the bucks, but I didn't quite like them braining the kids.' From Skull Pocket, the raiders journeyed to the Mulgrave and again at the 4 Mile and shot other natives, some of them with wounds received in the raid at Skull Pocket."
Koyan, Michael O'Leary, later recalled,
"Most imposing sight was when we struck Skeleton Creek. For nearly every stump of tree had a nigger's skull, as a trophy to the days when dispersing was the law. I strolled around and counted 16 of these gruesome relics."
Depredations were sometimes followed by the murder of a white man, which regularly led to a violent European response. One John Clifford disappeared from the Russell River gold diggings and his body found in late July 1889. As a result of this murder, a massacre occurred at the site which became Butcher's Creek. The late Najanji elder, Molly Raymond, recalled her mother, Granny Emily, finding her husband shot and hung up on a tree.
"But still alive. He tried to push his stomach back, but couldn't."
Molly's mother and grandmother found refuge with the Mullumbara Yidinji on the Mulgrave River.
As all their people up the top of the range had been attacked at the Crowbury ground, and because the police were around the district all the time, around Heberton Way, hunting and killing people, one girl was dragged through a blazing campfire by the native police. She escaped and hid in a log, but they found her and they killed her, and then the native police were sitting down and cutting her up like meat.
Inland from Cairns near Kuranda, George Hobson was killed in July 1890 on his property opposite Myola railway station. The Northern Herald later recalled that John Atherton, while making his way back to his homestead, made camp
at the wayside shack kept by Groves near the Clohessy River. In the morning, a pony ridden by one of the girls was missing, and its tracks followed. And finally, after penetrating the jungle for some distance, the natives were surprised in the act of cutting up the beast for an anticipated feast.
An elderly Jabberguy remembered being present as a famished 5-year-old who was salivating at the prospect of eating minya, meat, but as the pony was being prepared in its death throes, it kicked a stone that hit the young Buttercup in the chest. Her mother, Minnie, took her to the river to wash and cool the injury. The newspaper ominously concluded, needless to say, the banquet did not come off, for whilst down the river, Buttercup and Minnie heard gunshots, and later inspected the camp and saw the bodies of their people. In terror, they fled for their lives down to the Red Lynch Valley. The Queensland colonial government organised the native police, which operated from before the colony was established in 1848 to around 1910, a period of 62 years. Similarly, white revenge posses were privately organised, together with, on occasions, the native police, but more generally independently. The Executive Council knew what was happening, and they endorsed it. One only has to read the parliamentary debates in 1861, along with a select committee on the native police force of the same year, to see this. In particular, as historian Robert Orson Jensen has noted, the interviews conducted on the 16th of June 1861 and resulting select committee paper represents the first government of this state taking full responsibility for the force. In Queensland, reports from individuals and newspaper correspondents about massacres and violence received some orchestrated responses to newspaper reports attempting to refute allegations of wholesale slaughter. And nevertheless, ostracism and intimidation appear to have been far more prevalent in the small white population of Queensland. The arrogant authoritarian nature of the men in power also enabled them to ignore and dismiss these allegations. Whistleblowers were often entirely sidelined and forced out of the colony. It was during the 1880s that Queensland's annexation of eastern New Guinea was nullified by the British Imperial Government due to the colony's treatment of Aboriginal Queenslanders and Islander labour. It had been noted that upon annexing the Torres Strait Islands, the first act of the Queensland Government was to advertise the islands for sale at 5 shillings an acre, regardless of the fact that they were the homes and property of many hundreds of natives. The Times of London identified that
in Queensland it was impossible to converse with any average colonist, to read local newspapers, to listen to speeches in Parliament without perceiving that the native was regarded as simply an encumbrance on the soil, as being destitute of rights.
I have mapped only some of the massacres in colonial Queensland. However, it is my belief that it does not represent the full nature of violence on the frontier. One can understand why white colonial Queenslanders were ashamed of what they allowed to happen. But why has this conspiracy of silence persisted since then?